Hello, welcome to the 2023 Capwise Expansion Draft Lottery. We've got two brand new leagues this year, the Federal Fantasy Hockey League and the Atlantic Coast Fantasy League. Those two will be having two draft lotteries each to determine the order of their four drafts today. Let's talk real quick about how these drafts are going to work. Now, there's probably a lot of confusion. It's not very straightforward, so let's walk through them one at a time. The first draft is the prospect draft. This is a really unique draft that we've done since the very beginning here at Capwise. What we've done is taken all players. I'm going to bring the list over here. We've taken all players that belong to an NHL team. We've removed the elite players from the list. And sorry, let me reiterate. These are all JV eligible players that belong to each NHL team, JV eligible as of last season. Of course, haven't yet reached the NHL entry draft this summer, so there aren't any for next season yet. Anyway, but so we've removed the elite players from each of these lists, and you're left with a fairly lengthy, what is this, about 75 players, give or take, here looking at the Ducks. In this draft, you're going to provide me with a ranking of the 32 teams in order from best to worst. This is just your preference. It's your preferred ranking after reviewing these lists. There's a couple different ways to go about doing that ranking. You might look for the teams that have the most elite player and really target a specific team just to get that one player. Alternatively, you might look for a team that's really deep, that gives you the most option or the most breadth of players. Maybe you do one of each, whatever. All different approaches. But you're going to provide me with a ranking 1 through 32 of the NHL teams based on these lists. Now, really important to say, if there's a player missing from the lists, that's it. He's just missing. It could be a mistake. It could be because he's on this omissions list. Either way, it doesn't matter. If he's not on the list, you can't have him, and he'll be available in the amateur draft. But so here in the prospect draft, you're going to provide me with a list. I'm going to compare those lists offline and basically run through an offline draft to give everyone their two NHL teams. It's a 2-round draft. So you're going to end up with 2 NHL teams lists. From those lists, you'll select 15 total players. That could be 14 from the Ducks and 1 from the Coyotes or whatever. Or it could be 8 and 7 or whatever. 15 total players between the two lists. I've even seen it before where someone takes all 15 from one team and nobody from the other team because maybe they had the first pick and the 28th pick or whatever. It is a serpentine or snaking draft. So if you pick first, you'll also pick 28th. If you pick 14th, you'll pick 15th as well. I will say that most often these lists are so comparable. There's a few that'll stand out that are really good teams or whatever, but they're pretty comparable. And so what we've found in past years is that most of the 14 fantasy teams end up with 2 NHL teams that are within their top 5 of their ranking, or at least top 10 of their ranking. So most people walk out of this draft feeling pretty happy with the outcome. So I'm going to send these lists out today. You're going to review the lists and send me your rankings by, I believe it's Friday. Well, I have it here in front of me. It's the end of the day on Monday, the 29th. That's Memorial Day. So the end of the day on Monday, May 29th is when those lists are due to me. You can send me an email or send me a private message on the forum with your ranking. Once I have all the rankings in, I'll execute that draft offline, like I said, and you'll have results by June 2nd. That's a Friday, June 2nd. From those results, you'll then choose your 15 players and send me your list, and we'll start building out the league spreadsheet from there. Now, I do want to look at this notable omissions tab. These are the elite players that have been removed from their team's lists. There's 74 players listed here. All of these players will be available in Amateur Draft Part 1, which is our second draft. That draft operates on a separate lottery. So we're doing 2 lotteries today. The first one is for the prospect draft. The second one is for the Amateur Draft Part 1. Amateur Draft Part 2, which is our third separate draft, the order for that is determined basically as just an opposite order of Amateur Draft Part 1. I'll get into details on that in a minute. And then our final draft is the inaugural draft. This order is determined by a formula, a calculation of how good your draft positions are in the prospect and amateur drafts. If you have really bad draft positions in those 2 drafts, you're going to be drafting near the top of the inaugural draft. Let me slow down just a little bit and talk about these drafts one more time. The prospect draft, 15 players, generally kind of B-list prospects, all JV eligible. Amateur draft part 1, JV eligible players who were not picked in the prospect draft or who weren't even available, like all these 74 players here. Not included in amateur draft part 1 are the guys that are drafted into the NHL this year, 2023 NHL draft. Those players go to amateur draft part 2. Amateur draft 1 and 2 are both 6-round drafts, both snaking. Our final draft, the inaugural draft, that's for anybody that's left over. That's going to be your Connor McDavids and everybody else, along with anybody who didn't get picked up in these prospect drafts. It might be that you actually want to fill out your JV roster a little bit and add a couple more prospects through that draft, and then fill out your varsity roster and free agency after the drafts are all over. That's totally fine. Timing wise, these drafts, we already talked about the timing for the prospect draft. The amateur draft is going to be end of June, June 21st. We're looking to start that one. Usually takes a couple of weeks doing it the way that we do it, which is kind of a slow style offline, online, not live, basically. And then the amateur draft part 2 will start around August 1st. That'll finish toward the end of August. And then we'll start the inaugural draft by August 22nd at the latest, hopefully. The inaugural draft will run right up to the start of the season, and then we'll get going in early October. Looking at our draft lottery here, here's how this is going to work. Here is our prospect draft lottery. So this will determine the order of the prospect draft. This is just determined by clicking this button. It's going to give me a random team, and it's going to go right down the list. Your team logo will pop up in here, along with some details, team name, GMs, location, that sort of stuff. After we're done with the prospect draft lottery for the FFHL, I'm going to jump to the ACFL, do their prospect draft lottery, then jump back to the FFHL to do the amateur draft lottery. Now, as we do the amateur draft lottery, you're going to see a couple things happen. First of all, this is for amateur draft part 1. So you're going to see it populate in over here too. But amateur draft part 2, as I mentioned, basically is a reverse order of amateur part 1. So as we're going down the lottery for part 1, part 2 will also be filling in. The way that works is if you get first overall in part 1, you're going to have 8th overall in part 2. So basically the top half of part 1 becomes the bottom half in part 2 in the same order. The inverse is also true. If you draft 8th in part 1, you'll draft 1st in part 2. The other thing that's going to happen as we go through this draft, you're going to watch over here, inaugural draft. This is going to be live calculating as we draw the players to determine the inaugural draft order. When the prospect draft and amateur draft lotteries are both done, you'll have an official inaugural draft order at that time. But as each time I click that button, this little blue donut, each time I click it, you're going to see that inaugural draft go up and down as your team moves around based on the quality of your picks in these 2 draft lotteries. At the end of this today, we're going to have 4 draft orders totally selected. Again, these are all serpentine or snaking drafts. So you're seeing the first round here, the second round will be the inverse, and then so on. These will be posted on the forum. You still cannot trade. Everyone's going to want to start trading their draft picks. You can't do it yet. There's no trading until after the prospect draft selections have been made. So after you've chosen your 15 players, that's when the trade market will open, and you can start trading players and picks at that time. So without further ado, here we go. This is the prospect draft lottery for the Federal Fantasy Hockey League, the FFHL. First overall in the prospect draft is LA Dream. Second overall goes to the Norseman out of Vancouver. Third overall will go to, is it Ybor or Ybor? Ybor City Streetcars, Connor, up in Edmonton. That's top 3 in the prospect draft lottery. Just to point out kind of what you're seeing here, you're seeing the prospect draft populating here. The inaugural draft is also populating. This is based on, again, on the quality of your picks in the first 2 draft lotteries. So as of right now, it's exactly the reverse of what we've seen, because so far of the people who've got a pick, it's the Streetcars who have the worst. So currently, as of this moment, they've got the top pick in the inaugural draft. That will change, I promise. 4th overall, Parkex Paralyzers. 5th, oops, sorry about that. 5th goes to Channel 4 News Team. 6th goes to the Moscow Mules. Solid logo there. Really digging that logo. 7th goes to the Wiz. 8th, Whitmore Warblers. It's a great logo too. A lot of Edmonton teams, a lot of BC, a lot of Alberta here in this league. 9th overall goes to Gibson's Finest Yippers. 10th goes to Pilgrim Park Pit Bulls, bucking the trend, the East Coaster there from the US. That's our first American team here. Pilgrim Park Pit Bulls. 11th goes to Globo Gym Purple Cobras. 12th, I'm going to start to make you seasick a little bit here. I'm going to click it and then scroll down. So 12th overall goes to Cumnock Avalanche. 13th overall goes to the Angry Skunks. And 14th goes to Vancouver Knuckleheads. Look at that. I did not even realize we have 1 American team, 13 Canadian teams in this league. Okay, so that's the prospect draft, 1 through 14. As I mentioned, the second round will be the direct inverse of that. So Vancouver Knuckleheads will pick first in the second round. We'll work our way all the way back up to Lance with the LA Dream drafting 28th overall. That's your prospect draft lottery. As we look at the inaugural draft, again, it's the exact reverse order right now because it's the Knuckleheads who have so far the worst quality of picks. As I run through the amateur draft, it's going to start to get really interesting, but I'm going to make you wait on that. We're going to jump over to the ACFL. And so the prospect draft lottery for the ACFL. First overall goes to Big Z. Second overall goes to St. Anselm Hawks. Third overall in the prospect draft for the ACFL goes to Tropical Depression. That's co-GMs, Kevin and Devin there. We've got 2 teams in this league that have a co-GM situation. 4th overall in the prospect draft lottery, the Pythons. Is it Pucelinch? Pucelinch. Pythons. That's Jason in Ontario. A couple Jasons in this league too, by the way, so careful. 5th overall prospect draft goes to Wissota Walleyes. There's another Jason. Maybe there's 3 Jasons even. 6th overall in the prospect draft goes to the Melville Millionaires. 7th overall, New Jersey Hitmen. 8th overall goes to Up Your Kilt. 9th overall goes to Felino Mignon. That's terrific. 10th overall goes to Cole Harbor Highlanders. 11th in the prospect draft, Canadian Wolves. 12th overall in the ACFL prospect draft, the Library Cops. There's our other co-GM team. That's Henrik and Petter in Norway. 13th overall goes to Bushkill Brawlers 3. And the last pick in the ACFL prospect draft belongs to Bloomington Vipers. So there you have it. That's the prospect draft order for the ACFL. Once again, this inaugural draft order will continue to change as we go through the amateur draft. But first, FFHL. So once again, this lottery we're about to do will determine the order for amateur draft part 1, which is basically the elite players who were JV eligible for this past season. It will also indirectly determine the order for amateur draft part 2, which is basically the best players draft, like Connor Bedard and all the others who are drafted this year. And it will also indirectly determine the order of the inaugural draft. So keep your eye here on the left side as the inaugural draft order continues to update. First overall in amateur draft part 1 goes to the Wiz. Second overall in amateur draft part 1, Channel 4 News Team. I can tell you right now, Channel 4 News Team, 5th here, 2nd here, probably going to get 14th overall in the inaugural draft. I take that back. already, because here's the Wiz. Okay, 7th and 1st. So already the Wiz is worse. Channel 4 News is right there. You two guys are probably going to have the last 2 picks, I would say. But let's see what happens. 3rd overall in the amateur draft part 1 goes to Streetcars. Again, 3rd and 3rd. So I'd say 1st overall is still up for grabs here in the inaugural draft. 4th overall in amateur draft part 1 goes to Globo Gym Purple Cobras. 5th overall amateur draft part 1. Cumnock Avalanche. 6th overall, the Norsemen. And 7th overall, the Moscow Mules. Now I'm going to pause there and show you why. As you can see here, we have amateur draft part 1. Those are the 7 teams we just selected. You can see they've also been added to the back half of amateur draft part 2. When I draft our 8th team here, they're going to get 8th overall in part 1, but they'll get 1st overall in part 2. Can take a look over here and see where we currently stand. The teams that have already been selected in the amateur draft lottery are going to be at the bottom, and they all are. As we continue to go through, you're going to see people start to climb their way back up toward the top of the rankings here. Amateur draft lottery, number 8 overall. This is for 1st overall in amateur draft part 2. Basically Connor Bedard. Angry Skunks. 9th in the lottery goes to the Whitmore Warblers. 10th goes to Park X Paralyzers. 11th goes to Pilgrim Park Pit Bulls. Now looking here, I'm pretty sure we're going to end up with Vancouver Knuckleheads at 1st overall in the inaugural draft. They sit there now, of course, because they haven't been selected over here yet. Only 3 spots left. So it's almost a guarantee. 12th overall is going to go to Gibson's Finest Yippers. 13th overall goes to LA Dream. And once again, 14th overall falls to Vancouver Knuckleheads. So it's an easy choice here. Vancouver Knuckleheads will get 1st overall in the inaugural draft after getting 14th in the prospect draft and the amateur draft lotteries. 2nd overall in our inaugural draft goes to Cumnock Avalanche. 3rd to the Gibson's Finest Yippers. 4th, Moscow Mules. 5th, Pilgrim Park Pit Bulls. 6th, the Globo Gym Purple Cobras. 7th is Angry Skunks. 8th in the inaugural draft goes to LA Dream. 9th to the Whitmore Warblers. 10th to the Norsemen. 11th is Park X Paralyzers. And 12th to the Streetcars. 13th, Channel 4 News Team. And 14th overall in the inaugural draft goes to the Wiz. Keep in mind, like all of the drafts, the inaugural draft is also snaking. So the Wiz will pick 1st in round 2 of that draft. So here you have it. This is your draft order for all 4 drafts. I'll post this onto the forum right after this video is finished. Moving over to the ACFL. 1st overall in amateur draft part 1 goes to Cole Harbor Highlanders. 2nd overall will go to Bloomington Vipers. 3rd overall, Wissota Walleyes. 4th overall in amateur draft part 1, the Library Cops. 5th overall, the Pythons. 6th overall in the amateur draft part 1, Bushkill Brawlers 3. And 7th overall, amateur draft part 1 goes to Big Z. I'm going to pause there again. This next pick will be the 1st overall pick of amateur draft part 2. Once again, most likely Connor Bedard. You can see over here how the inaugural draft results have been changing. Pardon the brief interruption there. My daughter popped in. So where were we? Okay, so 1st overall, Connor Bedard, amateur draft part 2. Again, keep your eye on the inaugural draft. It's going to keep on changing here. 1st overall, amateur draft part 2 goes to Lino Mignon. 9th overall in our lottery here. Up Your Kilt. 10th is going to go to Tropical Depression. 11th in the amateur draft lottery, Melville Millionaires. I'm going to pause here. Now we got 3 selections left. We've got Canadian Wolves, New Jersey Hitmen, and St. Anselm Hawks sitting up top. I'm going to say most likely it's going to be Canadian Wolves here who are going to get our first overall in the inaugural draft. Vern got the 11th overall pick in the prospect draft and still hasn't gotten his amateur pick yet. So that's almost a guarantee. New Jersey Hitmen were up here at 7th. And I think we had the Hawks, way up here at 2nd. So depending on the outcome of these final 3 picks here will determine the final order, but it's looking good for the Canadian Wolves. 12th overall in the amateur draft lottery is the Hawks. 13th overall. There's the Wolves. And the Bushkill Brawlers actually are going to sneak in there. Where did they end up? Yeah, okay, 6th here and 13th here. So the Bushkill Brawlers are ahead of the Canadian Wolves in the inaugural draft order. But the final pick for the New Jersey Hitmen will drop them down to 3rd. And so there's your amateur draft part 1 and part 2 here. And our inaugural draft, first overall is going to go to the Bushkill Brawlers 3. 2nd to Vern and the Canadian Wolves. 3rd is Craig with the New Jersey Hitmen. 4th is our Norwegian friends with the Library Cops. 5th, just nearby there in the UK is Bloomington Vipers. 6th, the Melville Millionaires. 7th, Up Your Kilt. 8th to the Pythons. 9th goes to Big Z. 10th in the inaugural draft goes to the Hawks. 11th goes to Flino Mignon. 12th goes to Tropical Depression. 13th to the Walleyes. And last but not least, 14th overall in the inaugural draft goes to the Cole Harbor Highlanders. Once again, inaugural draft, like all of our other ones, is in fact snaking. So the Highlanders will draft first in the 2nd round. That's your final draft order for the ACFL. Again, I'll post this on the forum. That concludes the draft lotteries for today. I'm going to keep talking. This next part might be boring. What I wanted to look at now is how the calculation actually works, just so everybody is exactly aware of what's going on. If you don't care that much, you just trust that it works, then by all means, feel free to stop watching. I will say that we've used this same calculation a couple times now, at least once with the UFHL, and we found it to be a very fair way of calculating our draft order. I'm going to unhide a tab here. It's the expansion draw tab. Basically, for every pick you make, and that might be easier to visualize over here. For every pick you get in each draft, you get a certain number of points. A good pick means more points. So the more total points you have, the better your picks were from the lotteries. So the more points you have, the lower your pick, the worse your pick will be in the inaugural draft. So if you were to get first in the prospect draft, you get 11 points. All the way down to 14th in the prospect draft, you only get 1 point for that. You can see how it kind of drops down. The top few are weighted a little more heavily, and then it drops pretty quick. As we jump over to the amateur draft, the values are even higher because the amateur draft, the quality of players is significantly better than in the prospect draft. So first overall in amateur draft part 1 is worth 16 points as opposed to 11 for the prospect draft. That trickles down to 7th. Trickles down to 7th, where you get 7.4 points for 7th. Now, when you go to 8th, it doesn't keep dropping. It actually jumps back up to 14 points. And the reason is because even though you're drafting 8th in amateur draft part 1, you're drafting 1st in amateur draft part 2, and you're getting Connor Bedard. So it's going to be worth more. That's worth 14. Now, why isn't that worth 16? Well, because amateur draft part 1 isn't just this year's NHL draft picks. It's the past several years NHL draft picks. It's anybody who's still JV eligible, which is 120 games played. So anybody drafted last year or the year before is not, it's almost definitely not at the 120 games played mark. And honestly, a lot of those first round picks from even 3 years ago still haven't hit 120 games. And so you've got a lot of really high quality prospects available in amateur draft part 1. There are fewer players available in amateur draft part 2, at least of that same ilk. Connor Bedard being the best among them, of course, but that's going to drop pretty quickly as you go down the ranking. And so 14 points, 12 points, all the way down to 5.6 for the 14th selection in that draft lottery. Now, if you had 14th in the prospect draft and 14th in the amateur draft, as we saw the Knuckleheads did, that's going to be a total of 6.6 points. Easily going to be the worst point total of anybody, so you get first overall. So as we jump, that's the wrong one. As we jump here, you can see how the points actually shook out. So this is the selections that were made. You can see VNC down here at the bottom, 1 point, right? This is prospect draft for the FFHL, then for the ACFL, amateur draft for the FFHL, amateur for the ACFL. So then we look up your team, we add up your totals, and we put that over here under total points, FFHL, ACFL, and then we sort them based on the total points, lowest to highest, which goes down here. If there's a tie, it's a random order. So there's no tiebreaker per se. It's just a random draw between the two that are tied. And I do see there's a couple of ties here. I can see the streetcars are tied with whatever CNT is. I don't know these teams well enough yet. Sorry. But whoever you are, CNT, you are tied with the streetcars at 22 each. And then the order is just random there. It looks like streetcars, CNT there. So streetcars drafts ahead of CNT. So all of this is contained within here. I'm going to hide this sheet again under expansion draw, but it's there. That's what's driving these two sheets that you're seeing here, which is the ACFL and FFHL. This sheet will be shared with everyone. Totally on the up and up. You're more than welcome to dissect the spreadsheet, figure out how it all works and what it all means, just to make sure that it's fair. If you have any questions about it, please feel free to reach out. I want to make sure that everybody feels like this is fair. I know there's a lot of money on the line. And for a lot of you, especially the ACFL, you have no idea who I am. So there's not a lot of trust there. But this is very carefully done to be fair for everyone. And we have, again, ultimately found that your draft lottery results are not directly correlated to your actual performance in the fantasy season, which means it's a fair process. And it's not going to ultimately dictate the outcome of the season. That's all there is to it. So I'll post these draft orders up. I'll post the spreadsheet up so everybody's got a link to it. I'm going to send out the prospect draft lists this afternoon. And as I mentioned, you've got until the end of the day on May 29th to get me your rankings for the prospect draft. And then we're on our way from there. Thanks everybody for watching, and good luck.